Day 771 of the Trump administration, and the president is entering March with a host of new and growing political and legal challenges for himself, his family, and some one-time members of his inner circle. Just a few hours ago, one of those former associates, Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, asked a federal judge in Virginia to give him a prison term significantly below the 19 to 24 years called for under sentencing guidelines. His lawyers noted what they call special counsel Mueller's attempt to vilify Manafort as a, quote, lifelong and irredeemable felon, accusing Mueller of grossly overstating the facts. Manafort, now 69 years old, was convicted in Virginia of bank and tax fraud. He's set to be sentenced in Virginia next Thursday and in Washington, D.C., 6 days later. There has been much speculation about a potential pardon from President Trump. One former associate who more than likely will not receive a pardon is Trump's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen. He's headed to prison in May, but he spent 3 days this week on Capitol Hill denouncing Trump and detailing his alleged crimes.
He is a racist, he is a con man, and he is a cheat. The President of the United States thus wrote a personal check for the payment of hush money as part of a criminal scheme. People have asked me about whether Mr. Trump knew about the release of the hacked documents, the Democratic National Committee emails, ahead of time. And the answer is yes. Mr. Trump's personal lawyers reviewed and edited my statement to Congress about the timing of the Moscow Tower negotiations before I gave it. I am in constant contact with the Southern District of New York regarding ongoing investigations.
Do you think we need to review his financial statements and his tax returns in order to compare them?
Yes, and you'd find it at the Trump org.
Cohen's public testimony on Wednesday before the House Oversight Committee triggered a barrage of attacks this morning from the president, including, quote, now that the 2-year Russia collusion case has fallen apart, there was no collusion except by crooked Hillary and the Democrats. They say, gee, I have an idea. Let's look at Trump's finances and every deal he's ever done. Let's follow discredited Michael Cohen and the fraudulent and dishonest statements he made on Wednesday. No way. It's time to stop this corrupt and illegally brought witch hunt. Tonight, NBC News reports the top tax writing committee in the House is getting ready to ask for years of Donald Trump's tax returns. And Michael Cohen will be back before Congress next Wednesday, continuing the closed-door hearing he began yesterday with the House Intelligence Committee. Cohen's revelations came as Trump was hoping to score a big foreign policy win at his second summit with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. But talks over nuclear weapons and sanctions relief broke down, and Trump came home with no deal.
It was a very interesting 2 days, and I think actually it was a very productive 2 days, but sometimes you have to walk.
The real backlash came with Trump's remarks about Kim Jong-un and the death of a captured American student, Otto Warmbier.
Did Kim Jong-un tell you?
He felt badly about it. I did speak to him. He felt very badly. But he knew the case very well, but he knew it later. And some really bad things happened to Otto. Some really, really bad things.
Why are you?
But he tells me that he didn't know about it, and I will take him at his word.
More on that this hour. Trump had a new crisis brewing when he returned home from Vietnam. The New York Times reported Trump ordered his chief of staff to grant his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, top security clearance over the objections of intelligence officials and the White House counsel. The Washington Post reported that Kushner and his wife Ivanka Trump pressured the president to grant Kushner the long-delayed clearance. This year, both Trump and his daughter Ivanka denied he was involved. Today, White House counselor Kellyanne Conway was asked about that.
Was the president involved in Jared Kushner's security clearance process?
We don't discuss security clearances, but I will tell you that the president has the absolute right to do what was described.
Late today, Jared Kushner's lawyer, Abby Lowell, issued this statement, quote, whatever the accuracy or not of recent news stories, Mr. Lowell was not aware of nor told of any request for or action by the president to be involved in the security clearance process. Again, officials affirmed at the time that the regular process occurred without any pressure. Meanwhile, House Oversight Chairman Elijah Cummings has given the White House until Monday to turn over documents and set up interviews as part of its investigation into the security clearance process. Let's bring in our leadoff panel for a Friday night. Michael Steele, former chairman of the Republican National Committee. Annie Carney, White House reporter for the New York Times. Matthew Miller, former chief spokesman for the Justice Department. And Nelson Cunningham, a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, also a former counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Michael, when you look back at this week, which, like so many weeks, has felt like a month, and you think about what happened. Donald Trump went to Vietnam. He came back with no deal. Then he praised Kim Jong-un to the detriment of the death of an American student. Michael Cohen testified for 3 days on Capitol Hill. Jared Kushner's security clearance is in question once again, and Trump and his daughter appear to have been caught in a big lie. And his taxes might get subpoenaed. How bad was this week?
Oh, it's a bad week. I mean, I think the one word that sticks in my mind to describe this week is unprepared. The president was unprepared for North Korea. He was unprepared for the Cohen testimony. He was unprepared for the narrative now that's emerging around his son-in-law and his security clearances yet again. He was unprepared about the blowback from not just the way the summit went, but the very personal nature regarding the death of the student, Mr. Warmbier. And so it is consistent, I think, with what we've seen out of the administration. Again, a lot of people who could potentially help the president deal with a lot of these things don't have to lie about them, don't have to make up stories, are not in a position to do so because, as we saw in the presser, the president likes to throw stuff out there and makes it harder for folks to do that. And so that lack of preparation shows through every time.
Was Kellyanne Conway confirming that this happened by saying that if it did happen, the president had the right to do it?
Yes.
When it comes to Kushner's security clearance?
Essentially, yes. And with respect to the security clearances in particular, what should have been a fairly pro forma process really got pushed in the wrong direction because the president wanted a particular outcome. Yeah. He wanted his son-in-law to have whatever clearances he wanted him to have for the purposes that Donald Trump had in mind at that time.
Annie, why was Jared Kushner's security clearance held up for so long? And why did the White House counsel object ultimately? Why were security officials objecting to him getting the full clearance?
Well, we don't know the details of why the CIA and other intelligence agencies raised questions, but there have been problems with Jared's security clearance from the outset of this administration. If you remember, on the first forms he filled out, he failed to list meetings with Russian officials on it. You're supposed to disclose all meetings with foreign government officials, and he didn't, and he blamed it on a clerical error at the time. So we don't know exactly what they objected to, but we know that there's been questions about the Kushner company, his family's real estate business, and their dealings and business dealings with foreign governments. And the bigger question here, though, is, again, why the president, Ivanka, and Jared Kushner's lawyer, who all said there was nothing out of the ordinary here when there was. And, you know, the president, Kellyanne Conway is right in that statement that the president has the authority to do this, in which case the bigger question here is why didn't he just say, I want Jared Kushner, my son-in-law, he's my guy, I want him to have a top secret security clearance, and I'm giving it to him.
Own up to it, I guess.
Right. What was the pressure to cover it up? Why?
Matt Miller, you compared this to the way that Donald Trump also treats the criminal justice system. What parallels do you see?
So in each case, in both the class, you know, the security clearance system, the criminal justice system, like a lot of ways in which the government works, they're governed by longstanding rules, longstanding procedures. Decisions are made on the merits, oftentimes by officials who are supposed to be non-biased, and that is a system that in each case Donald Trump has always just really been hostile to and rejected. And so I think when we see him act in the security clearance arena, you've seen him in this instance. We now find out, you know, he's not content to leave decisions to career officials, not content to take their recommendations. He wants to intervene to help the people who are close to him. So this case, rewarding Jared Kushner with a clearance he wasn't qualified for. and on the other end of the spectrum, to use it to retaliate against his political opponents. We saw him last year yank the security clearance of John Brennan, the former CIA director who is a critic for him. And that is, of course, the same pattern we've seen him approach the criminal justice system with, where he has tried to retaliate against his opponents, people like Jim Comey and Hillary Clinton and Andrew McCabe, who he's called on to be prosecuted, while trying to get investigations ended to his allies, Mike Flynn, Paul Manafort, even to himself. And so, this is, it's in each case, decisions in these arenas are supposed to be made on the merits, not because of your standing with the president. And the way he corrupts them has just long-standing deleterious effects for the overall credibility of the system.
House Democrats have already said that they're going to investigate this, Nelson. This is just another component of what they plan to investigate. They had Michael Cohen on the Hill this week. Michael Cohen has been compared to John Dean during the Nixon era. And John Dean wrote an op-ed about that, responding to it. He said, what is most similar about my and Mr. Cohen's testimony is that we both challenged authoritarian presidents of the United States by revealing their lies and abuses of power. Mr. Trump is the first authoritarian president since Mr. Nixon, and neither he nor his supporters will play fair. Mr. Cohen will be dealing with these people the rest of his life. All Americans are affected by the growing authoritarianism that made Mr. Trump president. These people who facilitated his rise will remain long after Mr. Trump is gone. Nelson, what do you think?
Well, Cohen's testimony Wednesday was riveting. And don't forget, that was only 1/3 of the testimony he gave this week. He spoke Tuesday to the House Intelligence Committee. He spoke Wednesday in public, and we all saw that. Thursday, he spoke to the Senate Intelligence Committee. We only saw 1/3 of it. Think about this. All of the pieces we've seen this week, the Cohen testimony, Trump's tax returns perhaps about to be provided, Bob Mueller has known all of this for months because he had the opportunity to question Cohen for months. Every question that was asked of Cohen this week, Mueller has already asked him months ago. Trump's tax returns, you have to assume that Mueller had those not long after he began this investigation some 20 months ago. What we're seeing now, thanks to the House, is a slow motion reveal of what the Mueller investigation would have picked up and generated and collected over the last 20 months. I don't know when the Mueller report will come out. I actually am not confident that it will come out as soon as other people say. But it's going to be a blockbuster when it does.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.